Another great thing that omega-3s do is they reduce anger and aggression. Earlier this year, a meta-analysis was done, which is an analysis of randomized controlled trials. So there was 29 randomized controlled trials, which mean those are really great studies all on their own. 29 of those randomized controlled trials were looked at. Total, there was almost 4,000 participants that they looked at. And then they did an analysis of all those, and they came up with a position paper basically that stated what they're seeing based on all this research is that omega-3s help reduce anger and aggression. And this was published in a criminology journal. So the lead author on this is Adrian Raine, and I just have to read this to you. He's noted for his research on the neurobiological and biosocial causes of antisocial and violent behavior in children and adults, and he was the first scientist to use neuroimaging to study the brains of murderers. What this meta-analysis found is that the omega-3s, intake of consistent omega-3s, and this was looking at kind of short-term outcomes. If you can eat omega-3s consistently, that actually helps with the frontal cortex in the brain, which it has impulse control, it's premeditated thinking. So when they're looking at brains of murderers, they're looking at brains of criminals, they're looking and they started to see that these individuals have low amounts of omega-3s. This link between omega-3s and aggression was first started back in 1996 when they started to find a link between aggression in young adults and omega-3s. In 2001, there was a cross-national analysis showing that a negative association between fish consumption and homicide rates, which further solidified the connection between omega-3s, which is abundant in fish, and aggressive behavior. So that was in 2001. So we're slowly learning more and more. Since seafood and omega-3s are a relatively cheap and safe way to conduct trials like this, looking at a specific nutrient on outcome and behavior, a lot of studies start to emerge. So through the 90s, through the early 2000s, into the 2010s, there's tons of research being done on elderly and omega-3, behavior in children, ADHD, young offenders in the criminal justice system. So we're learning that there's a huge connection here. So omega-3s specifically help in the brain cells, and we don't know the exact function yet because they're still researching it, but they're seeing that omega-3 intake helps the neurons in the brain, specifically in these studies in the frontal cortex of the brain. It helps the neurons communicate back and forth to each other. So it's these little neuron cells, these brain cells that are talking back and forth through these chemicals and signaling. Omega-3s help that. And so if the brain cells in the frontal cortex, which controls, impulse, emotion, emotional regulation, if those can communicate better, they're thinking that helps with emotional regulation, aggression, all of those things. The awesome thing is that this meta-analysis looked at people that were kids, adults, people with mental health diagnosis, people without mental health diagnosis, male, female, in clinical settings, in community settings. The findings were the same across the board. It also showed a positive correlation with omega-3 intake on both forms of aggression, both like reactive or like impulsive aggression and more like calculated or proactive aggression. They're still trying to figure out like what this magical number is. They're saying whole food helps with the bioavailability. So if you can get it through seafood, that's the best way to go. And then they're also looking at, does this help long term? Do you have to be eating them all the time right now to get the benefits? But in general, eating omega-3s consistently makes people in general less aggressive and more emotionally resilient.